Happy New Year, Internet! I was actually going to do a New Year video this year, but it wasn't going to be this one. So very quickly, I'll just say I hope that you, yes you, have an awesome 2024, whoever you are, and try and spend more time doing the things you like doing this year, although I do know that that can be hard sometimes. Right now though, I'm more interested in the video that was put out a few days ago by Alex O'Connor. This is actually the second time he's prompted a response from me, so what do you know, he's an interesting guy. If you don't know him, you should check him out. The video is about the nature of violence in video games, and like that video, this one will reference violence and sexual violence. Furthermore, I will openly be talking about the nature of sex in society. No graphic content here, but just know that going in. I'm not arguing against the premise of the video either, really. I'm just putting a different ideological spin on a shared problem, and of course I acknowledge that there are problems to discuss here. I will, of course, be referencing my essays on Hannah Arendt in the context of the other videos on my channel, so there is some homework if you want it, but I hope that my general argument will be clear enough without that. And suffice to say, my opinions are mine, Arendt's ideas are hers. Alex's video is linked below, but if I'm going to boil it down to 30 seconds or so, he says that maybe Grand Theft Auto as a violent gameplay experience is just simply morally indefensible, even in the absence of real-world harms. His access point to this is through the extension to sexual violence. He asks us to consider that if a mass media artifact were to include interactive simulations of sexual violence, that we would all feel some basic moral repugnance at the idea of this being permitted as a form of entertainment. He then retroactively applies this to all forms of violence by denying that there is a bright line to be drawn. Obviously, this oversimplifies his case massively, and do tell me if you think I've seriously misrepresented him. He does also mention that in video games, children are usually completely off the table for violence of any kind, which is an important point that we will come back to. So of course, this is one of my opinion pieces, not as an expert, but just as a human. I'll be going into not graphic, but some intimate places, including for me personally, and I am going to be bouncing around a little bit, so do tell me if there's any nuance you think I've missed, because I will have missed some. Let's start with that sense of deep revulsion that Alex says we experience at the idea of including a sexual assault button in a Grand Theft Auto game. Let us ask, what if that revulsion is worth exploring? And crucially, before I get cancelled, why would it be worth exploring? I want to mention a couple of opposing voices right off the bat. Louise Perry has recently written a book and is arguing against the sexual revolution on the basis that it has not ended up giving women what they want. Comedian Fern Brady has worked as a stripper, and she is clear that she found nothing empowering in the experience. Both of these women make some great points. My thoughts below will essentially ask, would these things still have been the same if we lived in a more sex-positive world? Maybe they would, I don't know. And regardless, in this world we actually do live in, the concerns of women regarding sexual violence are an important part of any conversation. Do not mistake my purpose here. The truth, though, is that we live in a deeply sex-negative world culture, and many link this explicitly to the idea of patriarchy. Yeah, we can quibble around the edges of that, sure, but the result is the same. Sex is dirty. But why? Some of it, I guess, must come from a pre-contraception world. Sexually transmitted diseases within a family could once upon a time have caused a complete reproductive collapse, and obviously this would have been a bad thing. I don't think this is all about simply control of women, although I do think there are some men who internalize it that way. I'm talking about these red pill and MGTOW dudes who defensively describe sex in very unflattering terms. They are as biologically driven as the rest of us, that's why they're so defensive. I feel I must also represent the female side a little bit more. Some of the sex-positive feminists I have seen include Leanna Kay, who talks on the culture wars, Evie Lupine, who talks about the BDSM community, and Magda Kay, who is an intimacy coach. To be fair, of those three, I only know that Leanna Kay actually identifies as a feminist, and very much in a, nah, I'm taking it the fuck back kind of a way. However, if you're wondering why I'm not including any male voices, I don't have to. As a man, yes, I can confirm the sexual impulse is rather distracting sometimes, including sometimes which are regarded as socially inappropriate. And I have heard women say the same thing. But it's a part of the human condition, and we are never, ever going to get away from that. I suppose now I should get a little bit personal to disclose my own dysfunction in these matters. I will make it brief. I'm not relishing doing this either, you know. So, I grew up as a bit of a misfit, and I developed a pretty severe fear of dating and approaching women romantically. This is common enough. Whenever I did attempt it, I was either rebuffed or I was so deeply uncomfortable that I managed to self-sabotage in some way. Over the years, people have started to observe that I'm probably some kind of ADHD, so I guess that was another part of it. Whatever. But in short, I was an incel before it was uncool. But I always knew that it was somehow a me problem. The involuntary part of the behaviour was internal, not because of something that women were doing. In the end, I occasionally visited massage parlours in the UK, and this habit continued when I moved to Thailand, which, despite its reputation, is actually not noticeably more promiscuous as a culture. Thailand's sex industry is an aberration in many ways. In Asia, sex, much like in the West, is kept behind closed doors, and sex workers are still looked down upon. But what if they weren't? Today, I am actually married, just to be clear, but in the light of my personal history, I'm happy to declare that the world's oldest profession absolutely deserves much more respect. And it seems to me that in that declaration, there are hints of a more sex-positive world. It's just that all of us grew up in the sex-negative one. Moving on, there is a discipline that has become quite divisive in terms of the culture war, and that is evolutionary psychology. So, as far as I'm concerned, evo-psych is not everything, but it is a thing, and if you deny that to at least some extent, I feel you're being at least a little bit delusional. Now, of course, I'm not an expert here, and there are so many mechanisms that have been proposed for the various motivations of the sexes. I'm dealing in broad strokes, so I'm going to cut to something very simple. Consider the bonobo. Now, some of you might already know where I'm going with this. Bonobos, compared to chimpanzees, for example, are much more balanced in their male-female dominant structures. And when bonobo groups come into conflict, sometimes the females will initiate an inter-tribe love-in, which diffuses the tension. I can't imagine how that would work. That mechanism is just so difficult to understand. Now, humans are not bonobos, obviously, and we never can have that evolutionary heritage, but we are, or at least were, rational animals. So we could at least be asking the question, what kind of world would it be if a civilization was based on a more sex-positive set of principles? And are there technological points of crossover where we might be able to abandon certain power structures for others? Okay, that second one was more of a hypothesis, actually. I do have an example. It's far from a perfect one, and it is from fiction, but there's a series of books called Earth's Children by Jean Auel. The hero is Ayla, a Cro-Magnon girl in prehistoric times who falls into the care of a Neanderthal tribe. She is eventually exiled and finds love and a new people of her own kind. She does face some adversity, but Ayla is a bit of a Mary Sue, to be fair, but in a way that is actually developed in the context of the story. Her clan upbringing combined with her natural ingenuity makes her a de facto chosen one. She is literally the first person ever to ride a horse and to notice that male semen causes pregnancy rather than a spiritual impregnation of some kind. And the reason I introduced this series here is because of all the sex it's got in it. Oh my god. It is over the top sometimes. I can remember this even years later. And to be fair, I haven't reread it, so I may mistake some of the nuance. But the first book deals with Ayla's raising in the Neanderthal clan, and her experiences there are brutal to say the least. This is because of a personal antagonist, not the Neanderthals per se. But then she meets Jondalar, and he introduces her to the mother's gift of pleasure. Basically, Auel's fictional Cro-Magnon people, who do not understand sperm, treat sexual pleasure as a gift from the mother goddess, and it is part of the ritual life of their people. There are a large number of cases and counterexamples throughout the series, all described in laborious detail, but let's take that and transition now to the real world. We do know that different people find sexual pleasure in different things, and it's certainly not a case of anything goes. But my anecdotal suggestion from all this is that, like all things people are driven to do, the way that we interact with sex consists of a space of possibilities. And this conceptual space is not inherently morally tainted, and therefore it can be incorporated into a concept that I've brought up before. If you are a regular viewer, you might know the word that I'm about to say, and that is schol. I think I said it's schol before, but I think it should be schol. Schol, then, is Aristotle's sense of the word free time, which in Hannah Arendt's view means time free of everything in the human world, and that means everything political, at least in theory. It is time spent in pursuits which somehow transcend the human world. It has changed down the years. For Aristotle, it would have essentially been the vita contemplativa, the life of the philosopher. But in the postmodern Western world, what has the definition of schol become? It seems to me, at least, that it has become the individual's response to revelation. What is revealed, you may ask? Well, whatever you like. Every religion, every gender identity, every sexual preference, every hobby, even every antisocial pathology. The individual has a right to define it for themselves. This sounds terrifying, and it is terrifying. But what other option exists which enables the inherent human dignity that we say underpins our modern values? But don't worry, we do not drown in this postmodern morass. Arendt's concern with plurality in politics was her solution to the moral quandary of schol. In modern terms, you have the right to your own personal schol, but you do not have the right to impose it on another person without consent. Now, of course, this is not a video about consent, but suffice to say, the person of another person is a person, or else your person cannot coherently be a person. This is the inevitable result of the fact that it is men, not man, who dwell upon the earth. The problems come, though, when the narratives laid down by individual actions enter into the public space, which will inevitably become political. Let's just bring this back around to Alex's point. Schol is an activity that is not focused on the human world and is performed individually, although sometimes with the participation and presence of others. Arguably, this description applies not only to sex, but to video games as a category, and therefore, on the understanding that it is schol, see the loose end below, anything that happens in a video game with the consent of all participants is, by definition, non-political and cannot be covered by societal moral proscriptions. Another point Alex talks about is regarding the memes of Battlefield 1 and how they were considered to be in bad taste. But hang on a minute. Taste? That's not a moral judgment. This is connected to the cultural flashpoint over causing offence and giving trigger warnings. And I'm not going to lie, I am hugely disappointed that I end up coming down with the right wing on this one. Although equally, the right wing really need to stop being massive fucking hypocrites about it. Let me deal with that loose end though. Is it really schol? I did say arguably, and the idea that every gamer understands that their gameplay experience is enabling them to interact with something outside the human world and thereby interpret themselves, this is a big ask and not something we can confirm. Do they need to be consciously aware of it? Nonetheless, it is fair to ask whether in the absence of this awareness, these virtual experiences could still be harmful in some way. Unpick that knot at your leisure, but I would say that probably step one in changing any of this would be to make the term schol more widely known, but maybe that's just me. Alright, let's get to the big one. Alex also talks about children in his video and how they are generally off the table for even the simulated violence that we do allow. In The Crisis in Education, Arendt talks about the need for children to emerge into existence as newcomers of the species before they are exposed to the public space of the human world, and schools are meant to be a kind of liminal space to facilitate this. Following from that, I've come to feel that all of the questions about harm, especially to children, become a non-issue if all real children could be comprehensively protected from the public space and the activities that exist therein. I understand that this commits me to saying that it is morally permissible to establish a place where people could harm virtual children without any real child being harmed. I am not advocating for this, but I am committed to making that statement. Obviously, the nuance of this discussion is where the law comes in, and in video games, this is broadly delineated between teen, late teen, and adult levels of content, and I think this division broadly holds up. There is obviously the practical consideration of how one prevents children from being exposed to it too early, which will of course be different for every individual child. And there is the further question of whether there might still be harm done to adults in being aware of such things, which I suppose is something to do with why the right wing are such massive fucking hypocrites in the first place, in this sex-negative world we live in. Summing up then, if there were the possibility of a more balanced and healthy attitude towards sexual matters, and then by extension all types of violence... Whoa, I missed a clause there. If there were a more healthy and balanced attitude towards sexual matters, even sexual violence, and by extension other types of violence. Otherwise it all gets a bit Andrea Dworkin, and that's not my intention. And just to be quite clear, even in talking about this, I am experiencing that same kind of basic repugnance at the violation of the human person that Alex talks about and that I will mention again here. So I have to make that absolutely clear and make that small correction. Then perhaps there would be a catharsis in the repugnance that we do genuinely feel at the violation of the human person, and that might even be the gateway to reducing the actual harms of the world. I understand that I am representing a minority view here, and it is not reflected in the world as it exists today. If you want to accuse me of utopianism, I understand, and you may be right about that. Referring it back to Arendt though, we should surely be taking steps to account for the human condition rather than treating it as something shameful. So those are my thoughts on Alex O'Connor's thoughts of the GTA 6 trailer. Please let me know your thoughts. Looking on to 2024, the concept of history is at the final draft stage now, and I hope to record that before the end of January. There are probably 2 more videos on Fear and Trembling, although at the time of speaking I think I'm only going to record one of them, to be fair. I will also be moving forward with the quick videos on Confucius from time to time. But once again, Happy New Year, Internet. I really hope your year is a beautiful one, and I really hope that we all do not let inattention cause us to discard something with the trash that is actually genuinely important. Bye for now.